Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste friends. If you recall, in our previous lecture we ended with pointing towards history in vernacular coming out in 19th century, and I merely mentioned Bengali corpus by pointing out Bankim Chandra. In Hindi, I mentioned Itihas Timir Nasak by Raja Sri Prasad Verma, and we made this promise to return back with some focus on scholarship coming from Maharashtra. We also mentioned history of Maharashtra, Marathas by Grant Duff, and it is interesting to point out that Grant Duff has used a great deal of, he paid a great deal of attention to local vernacular sources like Vakhas. Maharashtra is a very interesting example, as even in the everyday life of the region, the state, even in our contemporary times, we can very easily observe a palpable engagement with history in terms of investment in heritage, in terms of the icons and other resources which physical landscape demonstrate there. And a great deal of this engagement with past goes back to the period that we are discussing today, or even last time we talked about 19th century. I just mentioned that Grant Duff has paid a great deal of attention to local sources, and a prominent local source was Bakhar. It is a prose historical narrative widely produced in 18th century Maharashtra. These are narrative accounts of families, events, or lives of prominent figures. These are descriptive in nature and also engages with causes and outcomes of important events. However, the first generation of Western educated Marathis, they clearly distanced themselves from using Bhakhar as important source to reconstruct history of Marathas. Bal Gangadhar, when we talk about first generation of Western educated Marathis paying attention to history, Bal Gangadhar Shastri Jambekar comes quite naturally, and he wrote history, he perceived history as Itihas Britanta. For this generation, history was a subject essential to the advancement of the mankind, along with other sciences such as logic, mathematics, grammar, ethics, etc. They distanced themselves from Bhakhars, and they also subscribed to colonial mindset when they decried lack of historical tradition in India. Another key figure is Gopal Hari Deshmukh, also known as Lok Hitwadi, and his time period is 1823 to 1892, almost stretching the entire 19th century. He adopted a unique way of combining anecdotes, information related to customs, festivals, physical landscape and legends from both English and other Indian sources when he wrote Aitihasik Goshti. One can roughly translate this as historical stories. Lok Hitwadi also pondered over the causes of decline of Maratha power in Satpatre or 100 letters published in the journal Prabhakar in 1840. Among others, noteworthy names when we talk about production of history from Maharashtra in 19th century are Moroba Kanhoba Vijayakar, who wrote Ghasiram Kotwal, a historical tale in 1864. Same year, Shankar Tatya Pharke wrote Sindesachi Itihas, History of Sinde Kingdom. And in the same period, same year again, Vishnu Bhatt Godse came up with Maja Prabhas अथवा 1800 sorry, एक मिनट टाइम थोड़ा. In the same year 1864, Vishnu Bhatt Godse came up with his travelogue named Maja Prabhas अथवा 1857 Bandachi Hakikat, My Travels or an Account of 1857 Rebellion. And this is a travelogue. He travelled from his village located in Deccan in Maharashtra to north and central provinces in India. He also witnessed the decline of Jhansi and other events in 1857. And in that sense, it is a unique account of 1857. From 1870s onwards, in Marathi scholarship, history emerges as powerful tool for the cause of nation building. For example, Neelkant Janardhan Kirtane, one of the first graduates from Bombay University, criticized Grant Duff's history in his essay which he read before the Students' Literary and Scientific Society in 1867. We must pay attention to the fact that these individuals are also working in a wider context in which there were institutional efforts were directed to history or Indology. Bombay branch of Royal Asiatic Society came up, Deccan College came up at Pune to majorly focus on Indology and recovery or collection of Sanskrit manuscripts. And in that context, our attention is drawn to Ram Krishna Gopal Bhandarkar. He was born in 1837 and died in 1925, a professor of Sanskrit at Elphinstone College and Deccan College, and also later he became Vice Chancellor of Bombay University in 1892. He wrote extensively and engaged with themes, wide ranging themes ranging from Vaishnavism, Saivism, minor religious systems. The books include A Peep into Early Indian History, a short sketch of the history of Deccan, and so on and so forth. He spearheaded search for Sanskrit manuscripts in Deccan, and his voluminous reports are quite useful sources, and these are on the material with critical philological analysis and empiricism on the collected materials that he discovered and with lot of rigor and precision there was efforts going into the dating of manuscripts as well. Some of the key postulates in Bhandarkar's research were clearly espousal of objectivity and search for truth in the fashion of Rankian positivism. His conceptualization of history was as a discipline which should be an unbiased, it should be chronological narrative of facts accessible through a righteous methods. And in this regard, his 1888 lecture on the critical comparative and historical method of inquiry is quite significant. He also made sharp distinction between history and literature, and unfortunately this sharp distinction led him to reiterate old colonial point that India had no written history barring some Jain accounts and some genealogies of few dynasties. Along with Sanskrit manuscripts, he also paid a great deal of attention towards the collection of gold, silver and copper coins, for rock and metallic inscriptions, and collection of accounts of foreign travelers. All these, needlessly to point out, are invaluable sources for the reconstruction of a region. Away from Sanskrit and classical domains, we naturally recall Jyotirao Phule, born in 1827 and died in 1890, a thinker par excellence, social reformer who worked tirelessly for the eradication of untouchability. Along with his wife Savitribai Phule, he championed the cause for women's liberation. He also, along with his friends, founded Satya Sodhak Samaj. He rejected high Sanskrit conventions and vocabulary in favor of more earthy and colloquial Marathi idioms. And he also used a popular form of paura to disseminate his ideas. In 1873, he came up with Gulamgiri, which offers an alternate account of Maratha past. Phule's vision of the past does not seem to have suffered from the drawbacks of the Indologist treatments, as we paid attention to his criticism of caste and his move away from the reliance on merely Sanskrit sources. Now, from Phule we move to another crucial figure, Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar, 1850 to 1882, a very brief period, very brief life, but a prolific writer in Marathi, known for his prose and his famous contributions. Major intervention is in the form of Nibandhamala or garland of essays, which he started publishing from 1874 onwards. He is also quite important for concepts and practices of history on which he reflected. He rejects foreign interpretations, sets out to write his own history as expression of affinity and closeness with a culture that can be properly written only by its own people. So, in a sense, we are now witnessing towards a completion of a cycle of critiquing British history, which were either based on non-vernacular English sources and which lacked the proximity, the affinity of experiences of the native and their perceptions, their subjectivities. He demanded an Indian history of the country. He emphasized the concept of pride and went back to associate pride with Desh, a multi-layered concept which did not merely mean territory, and it also in a sense was an attempt to embed his history in the local spatial dynamics, which obviously included elements of culture and nativism. Chiplunkar is also credited with propounding a genre or a style of writing called Chiplunkarwala. This is the core feature of this format is hard hitting non-fictional prose. His journal Kavyatihas Sangrah, which he started in 1878 with his three friends Kasinath Sane, Janardhan Modak and Shankar Shaligram. This journal published several Bakhars. So, there were definitely attempts to recover the local perspectives, local accounts, regional history. Chiplunkar's writings inspired a whole generation of Marathi intelligentsia, and one among them was Kasinath Biswanath Rajware, born in 1863, died in 1926. His contributions to the discipline of history, not merely towards Marathi history, but for the history in the continent itself, is perhaps unparalleled and unique. He edited a journal, Bhasantar, translation, from 1894 to 1897. Himself translated Plato's Republic into Marathi. He came up with 22 volumes of Marathyanच्या इतिहासची साधनेन. Please beg my pardon for my pronunciation of Marathi, as it is possible that I may lack the proper pronunciation, as I do not belong to the native Marathi speaking population. But honestly speaking, I am trying my level best to match the pronunciation. This is a minor disclaimer. And this 22 volumes of Marathyanच्या इतिहासची साधनेन, sources of Maratha history, he compiled between 1898 and 1912. This is a collection of and annotation and publication. These volumes, his corpus, includes collection, annotation and publication of thousands of documents from pre-colonial centuries. His collected works include 13 volumes on the theory, nature and practice of history. Again, he is not merely collecting the sources, but also with a great deal of rigor and perception, he is interpreting and showing a method for the future generation of historians. And these 13 volumes provide a modern philosophical basis and method for the Marathi historical scholarship. Reflecting on Rajware's contribution as a historian, modern contemporary historian Prachi Deshpande, in her monograph titled Creative Past, says that Rajware was interested in history as a philosophical principle and as a universal approach he deployed towards understanding human behavior. To him, the creative evocation or the literal conjuring of the past was therefore less important than an overarching framework within which to analyze the evolution and progress of human society. Rajware also published Modi handwritten documents in Balbodh prints, and this made them easily accessible to a wide community of readers and scholars. His preparation of jantris or historical calendars his Modak Jantri enabled cross-checking updates easily possible between the Sakka, Arabic and Christian dating systems. The Jantri made it easier for the researchers to use the Maratha archive comparatively quite easy manner. In 1910, he established Bharati Itihas Sansodhak Mandal in Pune. The anecdotes related to his efforts towards preservation of past knowledge for the collection of these documents and invaluable sources of Marathi history make a legend worth narrating in itself. However, that is beyond the scope of our lecture, obviously. So far I have tried to give a kind of survey to point towards the creation of a field of scholarship in Marathi which shaped historical scholarship as well as historical sensibilities not merely in Maharashtra, but also for the history of the nation in many ways. So far we have surveyed endeavors in history writing in vernacular, particularly paying attention to Marathi scholarship, and while if you recall our earlier discussion, while history was an important domain in which claims made by British colonial historians like James Mill was countered when he posited Indian history on civilizational grounds, and thereby clearly alluring to a civilizational hierarchy. So, history writing was one field in which Indian intelligentsia contested that claim. The other major intervention, the other field where British colonial claims were contested was in the field of economics, and economic critiques made in second half of 19th century by Indian intelligentsia leaders who are broadly termed as moderates. This critique is often in shorthand refers as drain theory. So, now in the second part of our engagement with 19th century, let us pay some attention to drain theory, its intervention in shaping the historiography, particularly economic historiography, for which the theory remained valid for several generations. and this was in many ways first sound critique based on robust concepts and backed by solid empirical data. Before we come down to drain theory, it would be helpful to mention few names associated with economic critique of British imperialism in the last couple of decades of 19th century. And we are in particular talking about grand old man of Indian politics, Dadabhai Naoroji. His book The Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, which came up in 1895, Mahadev Govind Ranade, his essays on Indian economics, which came up in 1896, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, his Economic History of India in 2 volumes in 1902, Subramanya Iyer, Some Economic Aspects of British Rule in India, which came up in 1903, and many more. This drain theory was an important tool of the moderates to argue and to critique British policies in late 19th century. And we need to place this theory in the wider context of 19th century as a whole and not merely in the second half of 19th century. And this historical background tells us, this further leads us back to the mercantile system in the middle of 17th century, which actually laid the foundation of the British Empire till 1800. This included, the historical background obviously goes back to mercantile system in the middle of 17th century, which laid the foundation of British Empire. However, we are not going to discuss that, because again that will be a diversion in given the scope of our lectures. However, we may come down to late 18th century, when on the one hand in 1765 British East India Company had acquired the Diwani rights of Bengal, and on the other hand in this period British trade almost doubled itself during the first 80 years of 18th century. It is noteworthy to mention that in the last 2 decades the volume of British trade almost trebled. This is particularly interesting because in 1776 American Revolution was a setback. Nevertheless, the economy quickly recovered. Here, and particularly for our period, we need to bear in mind that there was a clear distinction between white men's settlement, and by that I mean Canada, America, Australia, these kind of British settlements, and British attitude towards India. In case of India, the broader contours which were dictating British efforts were influenced by missionary concerns and a broader ideological frame which we talked about earlier and which is known as white man's burden. And this is precisely at this point Indian intellectuals like Rajaram Mohan Roy pleaded for non-discrimination between India and other dependent countries. He was pleading particularly to develop a relationship based on trust between the mother country and the colony. This is also a period, the first half of 19th century, say between 1815 and 1850, capital accumulation and British enterprises needed to spill over as a surplus to be employed in colonies. This was because after 1800 the Manchester politicians no longer encouraged cotton plantations in the British West Indies. The British industry, particularly textile industry, needed to open up cheap sources of cotton outside the empire, as the empire was unable to meet the growing demand for cotton. What was true about what was true about cotton was also true about other finished commodities. As I just mentioned, Rajaram Mohan Roy and others apparently wished to exploit this new climate of ideas, advocated that partnership based on trust, mutual respect and freedom would pay better economic dividends than an impoverished and underdeveloped colony seething with unrest. In this scenario of the first half of 19th century, we witness development of colonies as markets as well as sources of raw materials, and both these were crucial for British industrial development and capital accumulation. Thus, the scenario was a setting for a new dimension of imperialism, a combination of imperialism with the policy of laissez-faire or free trade, and these two, the policy of laissez-faire and imperialism, these two coming together can be termed as, or has been termed by scholars as, a phase of liberal imperialism. It is not that we do not have voices of dissent and criticism for British economic policies. John Stuart Mill, son of James Mill, whom we discussed earlier in previous lectures. John Stuart Mill himself a very influential thinker, and he was anti-imperialist. He gave a liberal version of spilling over of capitalism over space. To quote, to appreciate the benefits of colonization, he argues, it should be considered in its relation not to a single country, but to the collective economical interests of the human race. He further goes on to argue that the exportation of laborers and capital from old to new countries, from a place where their productive power is less to a place where it is greater, increases by so much the aggregate produce of the labor and capital of the world. It adds to the joint wealth of the old and the new country, which amounts in a short period to many times the mere cost of effecting the transport. It is interesting that same John Stuart Mill, who has criticized the various aspects and which we will come a little later, here in this quotation that I just narrated is advocating for a kind of world economy system, a type of colonialism for its beneficent role. This is a beneficent type of colonialism, one can say. This is the period where we know Britain ruled the waves. It became world's workshop, and in that context John Stuart Mill was arguing that British capital could play a beneficent role to the advantage of both the capital exporting country and the capital importing underdeveloped countries. However, he was also unsparing in his criticism of the exploitation involved in the unfavorable terms of the trade of colonies like India. And this criticism endeared him to Indian intellectuals in the second half of 19th century. The core point is that Britain's industrial dominance was an unquestioned fact. She produced perhaps 2/3 of world's coal, half of its iron, 5/7 of its small supply of steel, about half of such cotton cloth as was produced on a commercial scale, and 40% of world's hardware. While the flow of British capital, skill and enterprise, and above all British migrants laid the foundation of modern economic development in the white men's settlements like Canada, Australia, America, in the tropical countries such as India, the process of modernization was long delayed. This was also a period when Britain became an activating center of a worldwide multilateral trading system, a center that was the terminal point in the transfer routes through which balance of trade and payments were settled. The role of Britain guarding the sea routes, providing shipping and supplying short-term international finance through the London money market was of crucial significance. Here there was strategic importance of India's export surplus to the equilibrium in the British balance of payments during the whole of 19th century. Earlier in 19th century, we know India's export to China, particularly opium, and considerable export surplus which was known as colonial tribute consisted the cost to British rule in India was an important factor in the equilibrium of the British balance of payments. However, by 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, British East India Company gradually emerged as the only company, as it dislodged its competitors Dutch and French and acquired trade monopoly. Yet no economic modernization and industrial transformation we witness in India. In fact, after 1813, an unbalanced economic structure which lost an opportunity for moving in the direction of modernization, and a country which was earlier an exporter of manufactured goods was reduced to the position of exporter of food and raw materials and an importer of manufactures. Moving on towards the middle or the later half of 19th century, we come across the revolt of 1857, a watershed event which, when the reporting of the hatred of Indians towards British population, and these reportings were often exaggerated. These reportings were, we are referring to reports in British media of this event. These reportings, the event further accelerated racial animosity. After 1857, the British ruling elites, irrespective of their party affiliations, came to conclusion that India must be held down by force. In economic terms, between 1860 and 1905, prices rose by 400%. The tax burden went on increasing Indian poverty, which was deep. Indian poverty, which was already quite deep, was further deepening. Famines recurred rather frequently, and the toll of epidemics was quite decimating. and it is in this scenario Indian intellectuals like Dadabhai Naoroji began paying attention and started explaining the dynamics of a dependent economy. This was also 19th century was also a period when India witnessed deindustrialization. Between 1813 and 1850, the decline was quite palpable, yet as scholars have argued, it should not be exaggerated, as we also simultaneously find vast internal market opened up to free trade, and even in this period with all these adverse situation, we find that domestic cotton textile industry was not wiped out completely. Nevertheless, the basic economic evil of the economic transition in India was the lack of increase of productivity through widening and deepening of capital, a phenomena normally we associate with capitalism. However, while we see all the preconditions of capitalism here in terms of the widening and deepening of capital, but naturally we do not see capitalism. And after paying attention to this background, let us come to focus on Dadabhai Naoroji. He was a professor of mathematics and natural philosophy in Elphinstone College, Bombay, now Mumbai. He was earlier a successful trader, and he diligently compiled an analysis of statistics, paid attention to political economy reports, and towards the end he became a saintly figure inspiring young generations. He explained economic drain, which is a complex mechanism through which the economic surplus was extracted out of a poor colonial economy like India in two folds. In the first instance, in this complex mechanism, we find a process of internal drain within colony, and subsequently a considerable part of this surplus was drained out through foreign trade. The dynamics of this was functionally related to a net unilateral transfer of funds with all its adverse pressures on India's terms of trade. Here it is prudent to remember that Dadabhai only gave this concept a certain content and orientation. He showed how it was related to India's poverty and backwardness, and popularized this somehow difficult concept in such a way that its general essence eventually formed the very texture of Indian nationalist economic thought. Through this, he presented a framework for Indian economic thought, into which some of the broad features of Indian economy by default fell into place to form a coherent whole. What gave power to his drain theory, his economic criticism, was he used to quote several British authorities in this regard. For example, Sir John Soar, he quoted, and Sir John Soar noticed that from 1765 onwards, the surplus of revenue over expenditure under a system that combined government with trading was spent on the purchase of Indian manufactures and which was exported abroad to remit to England the surplus. Another example Dadabhai quoted was from the minute of Lord Cornwallis from 1790, when Cornwallis mentioned that the heavy drain of wealth causes, along with John Soar, Dadabhai also quoted other influential British figures. For example, the minutes of Lord Cornwallis from 1790, in which Cornwallis talked about heavy drain of wealth. And so, these frequent references gave certain credibility to Dadabhai's argument and his critique. We also know that as early as 1830s, Ram Mohan Roy had also extensively quoted British authorities, identified the items in the balance of trade. He also estimated the salaries and allowances of British officers in the civil establishments to give an idea of the savings remitted abroad and not spent or invested in India. So, basically Dadabhai was not the only person talking about drain. The references to drain was scattered across 19th century landscape. However, for the first time, Nauroji pointed or brought together these, mobilized these facts to argue that the nature of British rule is quite un-British in essence. And by this, he declared that a truly British course can and will certainly be vastly beneficent both to Britain and to India. He complained that the colonial government fails to fulfill its historic mission as the bearer of liberal and modern institutions and values in India. He quoted Savile Marriott, Commissioner of Revenue in the Deccan, who had said in 1857 that most of the evils of our rule in India arise directly from or may be traced to the heavy tribute which country pays to England. So, in this way we find that Dadabhai compiled two series of data. One was annual charges in India and another was annual charges in England. He assumed that 1/10 of the Indian charges from 1787-88 to 1828-29 consisted of items that involved an element of drain. The proportion was assumed to be 1/8 for the subsequent period. The home charges did not figure in the period which he counted, the period of 1787-88 and 1828-29. He also made a rough estimate of wealth transferred in the period prior to 1788. Aggregating the relevant quantities and capitalizing the total at 5%, Dadabhai arrived at a figure of 1,500 million pounds. He then checked this figure with the probable magnitude derived from the trade returns for 1814 to 1865, taking into account the exports, the imports and the bullion movements. After properly correcting the figures for the gross overvaluation of exports to India and of undervaluation of imports into England under the existing system of official valuation, the final figure that he obtained, capitalized at 5%, was of the order of 1,000 million pounds, which after adding the transfer of wealth prior to 1814 similarly capitalized worked out to nearly 1,500 million pounds. I gave this long and detailed estimation to acquaint you with certain statistical facts. However, what was important was not the account, but the theoretical basis of this estimation. Which was interpreting India's recurrent export surplus as a symptom of structural imbalance to be grasped in terms of exports, imports and bullion movements, and a net unilateral transfer of purchasing power affecting national income and expenditure both in India and England. Domestic consumption plus investment, which the transferred purchasing power represented, was an addition in the case of England and a subtraction, or rather a squeezing of or drain in the case of India. And here the crux lies in the concept of unrequited exports. We are reminded that Sir John Shore had said in 1787 itself that the company's trade produced no equivalent returns. This was a clear enunciation of unrequited returns. Dadabhai came to the conclusion that for over a century, India's export trade had continued to show a large element of unrequited exports, and it is important to note that the role of foreign capital in India was hardly benefiting Indian economy, and here again we find India unlike that of Australia, Canada and United States. Even the railway development was merely in areas and was in a nature only to further accelerate the drain and not to help develop Indian economy. And in the context of railway, interestingly, earlier in 1831 itself, Karl Marx had observed that what the British take from them, Indians, by them he means Indians, what British take from Indians without any equivalent return and quite apart from what they appropriate to themselves annually within India, amounts to more than the total sum of income of the 60 millions of agriculture and industrial laborers of India. India alone had to pay 5 million pounds in tribute for good government, interest and dividends on British capital, etc., not counting the sums sent home annually by officials as savings from their salaries or by English merchants as part of their profits to be invested in England. To sum up this criticism and the drain theory, significance of this economic critique lies in Dadabhai's formulation of two Indias. In reality, he argued there are two Indias, one the prosperous, the other poverty stricken. The prosperous India is the India of British and other foreigners. They exploit India as officials, capitalists in a variety of ways and carry away enormous wealth to their country. To them, India is of course rich and prosperous. The second India is the India of the Indians, the poverty stricken India. These ideas of a dual economy, an economy having distinctive zones for rich and poor, continues to reverberate our economic perspectives in so many ways. Dadabhai was extremely influential and his ideas, his drain theory remained a source. It provided a perspective for nationalist attack on colonial state across the colonial period in one or another manner. So, we have witnessed that in the course of 19th century, while on the one hand we come across the pioneering British efforts in the field of history writing, as we talked about James Mill's history of India. Subsequently, we also saw that this terrain was not homogeneous, not monolithic, not free from criticism and contestations, and there were various layers. Criticisms came from other British colonial administrators themselves, also quite vociferously and at different terrains from native intellectuals when we talked about vernacular history projects in the context of Maharashtra. And thirdly, we talked about the economic criticism in the form of drain theory, which was the major plank for moderates' attack on British colonialism. At both these terrains, in the form of history writing and in terms of economic criticism, we find that these have very long influences, and the trajectories, the debates were keenly followed, and these echoed many times, be it in the form of economic historiography of colonial period or the debates on writing history from the regions and using regional sources, local sources, vernacular registers, or the institutional efforts which go in the making of the field of history. And it's this significance of 19th century which in many ways shaped and influenced the course of historiography in 20th century, which we will see. One obvious strand where these historiographical interventions played extremely crucial role was the field of nationalist history, which we are going to discuss in our next lecture. Thank you.